Go ahead, Lisa.
Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you and welcome to the Heart of the Farm session today. I'm Lissa Seefeld, as Jenny mentioned, and I'd like to introduce Mark Stephenson. Mark Stephenson is the Director of Dairy Policy Analysis at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. In this position, Dr. Stephenson conducts and coordinates research and outreach activities related to the dairy industry. He's very involved in applied research at the firm level, including milk processing costs, new processing technologies, farm costs, and price risk management. He is also active in sector level price forecasting. Mark is also the director of the Center for Dairy Profitability. Mark will spend the next hour with us explaining how milk check values are determined, including recent items like the negative PPDs. He will also answer some questions about premiums paid for milk and other questions that you may have about your monthly milk income. And just as a reminder, for those of you that do have questions, please drop those in the chat. We do have you on mute while Mark is talking, but if you have questions, drop those in the chat. We'll try to address them as they come up if they're relevant in the programming material that Mark has. And if we can't figure out where they fit, we'll try to get those answered at the end of the presentation. So with that, Mark, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Lissa. Appreciate it. And I'm happy to cover today this topic of understanding your milk check. Milk checks, I think, are always welcome. They're often mysterious and occasionally frustrating. But I'm going to try to clear up at least maybe a few things today, and feel free to ask questions as we go along. If you put them in the chat box, I think that Lissa will probably maybe take time to stop me or interrupt me so we can do this as we move along. I'm going to share my screen just now and take us through a few items that I think are going to be useful. Understanding my milk check. I want to back up just a little bit because the bulk of the milk check is coming from your payments on components. And I'm going to spend a fair amount of time talking a little bit about that, because I think that for most people, it's pretty mysterious about how is it that those values change, every month. And what is it that, gives us those values? And to do that, I also going to back up a little bit further than that and just say, what is it that's special about milk? We get those values, by the way, from federal milk marketing orders. And you might ask, well, I mean, why is milk regulated like this? I mean, corn isn't regulated, soybeans aren't regulated, but milk is regulated. And in fact, almost every country that has a significant dairy industry has, or currently still does, or has had in the past, some levels of regulation for their milk and dairy products. But I wanted to just bring up the fact that milk is unique, I think, as a product. It's highly perishable, unlike products like corn or beans or many other things that we grow. Even beef, you've got a window of harvest time on that product, and it can be stored for a little bit of time. It's not quite like milk. Milk is also bulky. It's 85% water, so it's expensive to move it down the road very far. It's produced and has to be sold 365 days a year. Doesn't have a harvest season per se. We have specialized assets for the production. If you're basically a corn and beans farmer, you can plant and grow and harvest with approximately the same equipment, those two different products, more or less of one. But with milk production, if you've put $250,000 into a milking parlor, the only thing that parlor can do is milk dairy cows, not goats, just dairy cows. So it's very specialized in assets for the production of milk. We've also always had many more sellers, meaning farmers, than we have buyers, meaning processors. And that oftentimes puts a marketplace in a vulnerable position. So, that's a characteristic also of our dairy products, prices and things that have made us a bit vulnerable to price movements. We've also had what an economist might call a relatively inelastic demand for dairy products. And by that, I mean that quantities only have to move a little bit for prices to move quite a lot. So, a change in milk production of 1 or 2% will move milk prices a long way up or down. Same thing is true on the demand for dairy products, that they can take a relatively large change in price and consumers don't alter their consumption by much. They do by some, but not by much. So it's relatively inelastic. And when you look at these bundle of characteristics, this has historically led to something that an economist would call destructive competition. Just back in the 1800s, for example, if you were peddling milk door to door or selling it to your customers, it's pretty hard to distinguish why my product is better than my competitor's product. It's both cold and presumably has reasonable qualities about it. It's white. And the only way that I'm going to sell more in comparison to my competitors is if my price is lower. And so these milk peddlers used to turn around and say, well, I know I paid you 5 cents a quart for your milk last week to farmers, but I can only afford to pay 4 cents this week. And they would try to gain market share by doing that at the expense of farmers. That's destructive competition. What we found out was that federal orders stepped into that position to try to help, be um, a policeman, if you will, to relegate the traffic out here in a federal milk marketing order. Co-ops tried to do it themselves, and they came up with a lot of the ideas that we have in federal milk marketing orders, but they weren't big enough to effectively discipline the marketplace. And when that really began to erode during the Great Depression, it was a time period when people were convinced that cooperatives can't do it on their own. And when we had the Agricultural Adjustment Act of 1933, and later in 1935 it was amended, we first got milk marketing orders. And that Marketing Agreement Act of 1937 passed the orders into preserved order language, and it's part of permanent legislation. So it's there until Congress would say it's no longer there. It's not temporary, it is permanent legislation. There are a lot of things that are unique about federal milk marketing orders. For one thing, only dairy farmers get to vote on federal orders. Whether you have them or don't have them in a region is a dairy farmer vote. When they're looking at changes in a federal milk marketing order, those changes are approved or disapproved by dairy farmers only. Nobody else gets to vote. Processors don't, consumers don't, just dairy farmers. But dairy farmers aren't regulated under a federal order. Only processors are regulated. And class 1 processors, the fluid milk, beverage milk processors, are the ones who must be regulated. So if you have a fluid milk processor in a region that's regulated by a federal milk marketing order, they have no choice in regulation. They must be regulated. All of the other processors, like our cheese processors, for example, or yogurt or other processors, may be regulated. Don't have to be, it's their choice. And we make changes to or bring a federal milk marketing order into being or take it out through a federal order hearing process. It's a legal process, much like a court of law, although it's different because anybody can come and testify at that kind of hearing. And choices are made based on only what's heard at a hearing process. So if evidence isn't entered into a court, then federal milk marketing orders can't make a change. And this requires these kind of rules that U.S. Department of Agriculture issue a fair and balanced recommended decisions for dairy farmers to vote on. And when they say fair and balanced, they mean that. It has to be fair and balanced for processors, for consumers, for farmers, everybody. And if they think it is, then they would put that forward, and then farmers get to vote. But when farmers vote, they don't get to vote on just a change in a decision. You're voting on the entire federal order or nothing. So that's kind of a unique thing, but that puts the balance of power back into a fair place. But it puts a real deal of onus on USDA to make sure that they issue a fair and balanced recommended decision. So that's kind of unique to federal orders. Federal orders have two primary tools. One of them is classified pricing, which basically means that milk price is based on what the milk was used to make. Now, that's a little bit different. I mean, we don't charge differently for corn if it goes into animal feed or if it goes into ethanol or corn sugar. So we don't have classified pricing in most places, but we certainly do in milk marketing orders. And we're going to charge more usually for products like fluid milk or beverage milk, and we'll charge a lot less for milk that's used to make skim milk powder, for example. And you can understand, I think, that dairy farmers, if that were the case, would want to all sell their milk to fluid milk plants, and because they would want the highest price that's available to them. That would cause some chaos in the marketplace, and that's why they have this idea of pooling. And this is sharing the revenue among producers, so you don't all fight to send your milk to the same plants. So classified pricing and pooling are the two primary tools that we use in federal milk marketing orders. These orders are regional. They're based historically on a territory where fluid milk bottlers compete for sales. And the values are only different in class one across the country based on class one differentials. And those differentials tend to be highest where milk is most deficit. Areas like Florida, for example. We don't have much milk produced down there relative to the population, and those differentials are high down there to try to encourage milk production. And when you get to an area like California or Idaho, where we have a lot of milk produced and not a lot of people, the class one differentials tend to be fairly low. They're also relatively low up here in the upper Midwest. Just to give you some idea, this graphic is showing you two different things. We peaked in the number of federal orders back in the 1960s, where we had a little more than 80 federal orders. Today we have 11. But you'll also see in that green line and shown off that right-hand axis that we have increased the amount of milk that's regulated under a federal order from about 30% back in the 1950s to about 65% of the milk that's produced in the US today that's regulated under a federal order. We have a number of states that also have state level orders. Most of those look quite a bit like a federal order. California used to be the biggest state order, but it's now part of the federal order system. But we still have orders in Pennsylvania and in Maine and in western part of New York, a number of different places in the country. There's also some milk that is just unregulated, where there's no federal order at all. And if you take a look back in time, back in the 1950s, there was relatively less milk of any kind in the US than we have today. But the class one volume back then was about 65% of the volume of milk in a federal order. Today, it's less than, it's a third of the volume of milk. Most of the milk in federal orders is manufacturing milk. Now, by the time I've gone through these few slides, I think you can understand that an awful lot of the milk that I'm talking about in federal orders has been class one, not manufacturing milk, but beverage milk. And federal orders are fundamentally a fluid milk product. They have grown up around fluid milk, and that's what they've been targeted to try to address issues for. Manufacturing milk is kind of along for the ride. So that makes it a little different in regions like the upper Midwest, where we're mostly manufacturing milk. How do federal orders price that milk that's on your milk check? Well, this would be an economist's view, that if you were going to try to price milk, clearly farmers have a different idea about what the price should be. They would like a higher price, and at a higher price, this is a milk supply curve that we would call it, just a graphic representation. At a higher price, farmers are willing to produce quite a bit of quantity of milk, much more so than they are at a lower price. And for consumers, the demand is just exactly the opposite. At a high price, they want relatively little milk. At a low price, they'll take quite a bit more. And there's only this one area right here where we all agree on this price and this quantity. Anything else causes, a problem with either too much or too little milk on a marketplace. So this is what we're trying to do when we regulate prices. We want to get to this market clearing price. But the truth of the matter is that in reality, those lines aren't sharp and fine. They're kind of thick and fuzzy. We can't observe, those precise things. And so we have something like this range that we know we're shooting for. This might be a price over here that's a little too high. This is a price that's probably too low. We know that the center of the target may be there, but that's pretty hard for us to actually hit. But we're going to try to shoot in there if we can. Now, the problem can be that if we regulate prices always on the high side of the market, this means that dairy farmers are going to want to produce like this much milk. And at this higher price, consumers are only going to want to consume like this much milk. So we have too much milk for the marketplace. But if we regulate down here too low, consumers are going to want more product and farmers are going to be willing to produce less. And in that circumstance, we can let premiums in the marketplace exist to try to pull that price back up to here. And that's kind of what federal orders do. They're going to shoot a little below the bullseye and try to let premiums fill in here. Premiums are a market that mechanism that lets us get milk prices back to where they ought to be. So we have some different options for setting those milk prices. The one that we used to have, some of you would remember, the Minnesota-Wisconsin price. That was milk that was unregulated by federal milk marketing orders. That was grade B milk. It can't be used for fluid milk purposes. And so that unregulated milk became a competitive pay price. Plants competed for the milk that was coming in there, and they paid what they needed to pay to get the amount of milk they wanted into their plant. We surveyed those plants and we got that what did you pay last week kind of price, and we used that as a starting point. But pretty soon grade B milk was not very much volume anymore, not that many farms producing grade B milk. Most had either gone out of business or had converted to become grade A farms. And so you can't regulate what you can't observe. And then we move to this product price formula out here. This is sort of stepping up the marketplace one chain. And we're going to look at dairy products prices that are competitively determined in a marketplace, and then see if we can't back into milk prices. Here's kind of an example. Here's the farm, here's the plant. This is where we used to survey right here for the grade B competitive pay prices. But now we have to look up this market chain from the plant and the products they make from milk before it goes into resale. And we look at a wholesale price right here and survey that. And then we say, can we impute the value of the milk that went into it based on how these product prices are moving around? That's what's done. So here's the classified pricing. We have in federal milk marketing orders 4 classes of milk. Class 1 is the beverage milk, generally the highest price that's paid, not always, but usually. Class 2 is just an amalgamation of products. It's what we call soft dairy products. And those are things like yogurt or sour cream, cottage cheese, that type of thing, soft dairy products. And class 3 are hard cheeses like our cheddar cheese or specialty cheeses made here, mozzarella's in there. And then class 4 is butter and milk powders. So when you look at this, this classified pricing, if I were to ask you the question, what is it that you see that's consistent with that ordering of prices? There are a number of things you might look at and notice, but one of them is that perishability is involved here. The products that are most perishable are class 1, followed by class 2, followed by these cheeses, and followed by butter and powder ultimately. These products can be kept quite a long time. These only, a couple of weeks at the most after they've been processed. So perishability falls into that. And I want you to remember that when a federal order regulates prices, they don't regulate the price, they regulate a minimum price. You're welcome to pay more, but if you are a regulated plant, you must pay at least that minimum price. And I would point out down here that this classified pricing and pooling were cooperative ideas, and they go all the way back to the 1880s in the Boston market, and it predated our federal orders by about 60 years. So these ideas have been around for some time, and federal orders are now the ones that implement them. Here's what I mean by pooling. Pooling is a pool of dollars. It's not so much a pool of milk. If we had classified prices in a federal order that looks something like this, remember I said class 1 is usually the highest, like $20. Class 2 might be $18.50, class 3 $18, and 4 $17.50. And if this is the amount of milk in the order that's used under class 1, this is more like the Northeast order, by the way, and not so much like what we have, where we would have mostly class 3 milk. But this is the utilizations. And if you multiply this price by this percent utilization, you'd get $8 over here and so forth. And if you added those all up, you'd get a weighted average price of $18.80. That's what would become the blend or uniform price. Now, this is kind of a simplification of a pool, but that's approximately what goes into that calculation. That's how we get a uniform price. And this is the kind of price that we're going to try to pay to dairy farmers. Individual dairy farmers wouldn't get the $20 for selling their milk to a fluid plant. They would get $18.80. And if a farmer sold their milk to a butter powder plant, they wouldn't get $17.50. They would have to get at least this $18.80 out here. So everybody receives that. That's what we mean by pooling. Remember, I said that these class 1 processors must be regulated, and the other processors may be regulated if they want to. And the question might be, why in the world would you want to? And I said it's a pool of dollars, not milk. And these other processors can receive what we would call an equalization payment or a draw from that pool to pay their dairy farmers. And the cost of this is that they are going to be audited plants. They're going to have paperwork to fill out on a daily basis. They're going to have to do what we call perform for the marketplace. So if class 1 processors needed extra milk on some day, a cheese plant might have to give up milk to that class 1 plant. Or likewise, we kind of expect on a weekend, if a class 1 plant doesn't want to process on a Sunday, that milk is going to go somewhere else, maybe to a cheese plant who didn't necessarily want to process more on a Sunday, but they would. So that's what we call performance. They provide a balancing function in the marketplace. So here's an example that one like we were using. Remember, class 1 had an obligation of $20 in total, but this was the pool value, this $18.80, which means that you're going to pay your farmers $18.80 for milk at a minimum, but there's $1.20 left over, and that goes into the pool. A class 3 plant is going to pay their farmers at least $18.80. or excuse 1880, but they only had to pay an $18 class 3 price, which means they get to take a draw from this money up here in the pool of 80 cents to be able to pay their producers that. So this is why these other plants would want to be in this pool, because normally they're getting money out of the pool to be able to share with their producers. That's why they are in the pool in the first place. So if you must be pooled like a fluid plant, are there benefits? Well, you know what your competitors are also having to pay. You do get that performance, delivering milk at a plant when you need it. And you do get some advanced pricing that lets you know the price of milk before you buy it. That's not true for manufactured milk prices. They're going to bring milk into the plant, make cheese, and they won't know exactly what that milk cost them until after the cheese is already made. So, that's not a great business model, but that's the way it works. Here's some timing out here. The advanced prices for class 1 plants, let's say we're trying to price December milk, and we've just received our December checks after all. So this is what we're trying to price milk in this month of December. A fluid milk plant would know on the Wednesday that is on or before the 23rd of the month what their milk price is going to be. That Wednesday happened to be right here. So on this Wednesday, the 18th, fluid milk plants knew what their December milk price was going to be. These other plants, however, are going to know on the Wednesday that's on or before the 5th of the month. So here's the 5th, but that's a Tuesday, not quite the Wednesday. You have to go back to the previous week. That would be here. So by the time we get to the December time period, December 30th, then the manufacturing plants would know what all of this milk that they already took into their plant and used to make cheese was going to cost them. So that's the timing issue. And that will come up in just a minute when we talk about things like PPDs. The product price formulas that we use are based on a weekly survey that the Agricultural Marketing Service does. So plants that make certain products like cheddar cheese in blocks or barrels, they have to fill out this form and report how much cheese did you make and what did you sell it for. And that gets reported every week. Same thing is true for plants that make butter. Same thing is true for plants that make non-fat dry milk and for plants that make dry whey. Those are the products that we're trying to track and use to price milk. And, this is the most accurate value to look backwards when we already know what those prices were. But it's a better business model for fluid plants to know what the costs are going to be before you use them. Let's just look at a stream of milk in a cheese plant. So milk comes in, we can spin cream off of it if we want to. We can add additional ingredients like powdered milk if we want to the vat, and then we make cheese. That's our primary product. But we also get whey off of that. And off of the whey, we can get whey cream, which can be made into butter, or we can make dried whey. So we want to price milk, but we're going to look at these three end products out here: cheese, dried whey, and butter. And if we survey for those prices, hopefully we can go all the way back to determine what a milk value might be. This is what that dairy product sales report looks like every Wednesday when it comes out. And this is the product report that came out on December the 30th. And you can see the Wednesday weeks here that are shown previously and what the weighted average price was across these plants and what the total sales product of butter actually was. So you can use this to determine what that monthly price for butter was. And I actually have a little worksheet that I included in those supporting documents that if you want to calculate something like that, you can do it. You go back here and take these values of the weighted price and the sales, and you can enter them in here and follow these simple rules, and you get the weighted average price. This is what the product price formulas actually look like. You're going to take that price that's here, and we have a price for butter, and this is a simple formula, and it just says that we estimate that it costs about 17 cents to excuse me, convert milk into a pound of butter. That's called the make allowance out there. So a plant would have to buy the milk. They'd have to incur these processing costs. And then they also have a make allowance. This basically says how many pounds of butter can you make from 1 pound of butter fat. And since our butter is about 80% butter fat, we can actually make about 1.2 pounds of butter out of 1 pound of butter fat. So this goes into the formula, and we get a butter fat price. And that's the price that shows up on your milk check. Here are product price formulas. And if you look, here's the butter fat price. We take the butter price that comes from the survey, we subtract this make allowance, and we multiply it by a yield factor. And we have the same kind of things for protein price and other solids price and somatic cell adjuster and that type of thing. These are included in your support documents too. So you can calculate all of those if you're interested in it. And this is kind of thing that we get. Here are the butter prices for the month of December. This is the non-fat dry milk price. Here's showing you both the 40-pound blocks and the 500-pound barrels of cheese, but the weighted average price across all of those is this cheese price, and that's what you would use. And here's the dry whey price. And then putting all of that stuff through those formulas that are included in there, you would get these price. And this comes on a sheet that's known as the announcement of class and component prices. And these are the values you'll see on your milk check. Down here's the butter fat price, the non-fat solids price, the protein price, and the other solids price. So now that's how we determine how much money there is in this pool, if you will. And that is sort of how big is the pie. That's price discovery, that's classified pricing, and it determines how many dollars we have in this monthly pool that gets distributed back out to dairy farmers. But now let's talk about how does it get distributed back out. Well, the biggest part of your milk check are going to be component values of butterfat, protein, and other solids. And other solids is coming from the whey, and it's mostly lactose. But we get paid on the basis of component values in the class 3 price. But usually, not always, usually by the time we've paid out these component values, there's still a little bit of money left over in the pool. And that little bit of money that's left over in the pool gets paid back out in something we call the producer price differential, or the PPD. And that's just the residual value after we paid for components. I want you to look sometime at the market administrators' pool price announcements, and you'll see that that blend price they talk about is exactly equal to the class 3 price plus the PPD. Okay, so always blend price is equal to the class 3 price, because that's where the component values come from, plus the PPD. And the PPD will be negative if you've paid more out in class 3 component values than you have in the pool. That's what's been happening this past year. We've paid more out in component values than we took into the whole pool. So it's not as though somebody is cheating per se when that's a negative value. This is just an accounting process that's done. Just give you some idea. This is all the way back to January of 2020, not 2021. But to look at the pool value at that time, about half of the value was protein in your milk check. A little less than half was butter fat, 4% was PPD, and 4% was other solids. And then there's a tiny amount, 1%, that was a value of the somatic cell count. So this is an adjuster in your milk check for milk quality that's better than 350,000 somatic cells per milliliter. So this is all about how do we split the pie up? And that's the way we've chosen to do it in federal milk marketing orders. This PPD can be negative. In this case, a year ago, January 2020, it was positive, but it only represents about 4% of the milk check. So when can those PPDs be negative? One of the ways that it happens is when prices are rapidly rising. Historically, that's been true. So for example, if we have price opinions that are moving up fast from, say, November to December to January, then if you take a look at what are the prices that are used back here in the survey, it comes from these first 2 weeks in early November when the prices may have been lower. And if we're looking at December, when prices may have been higher, and class 3 is high here, and we're looking backward at it, you can pay more out in the value of components because of that than you took into the pool, because class 1 price is going to be below class 3 price. That gives us a negative PPD. I usually tell producers under those circumstances, don't worry about it. That's actually a good thing. Because it just means that prices are going up fast. So I would take a negative PPD because of that reason almost any time I could get it. The flip side is also true. When prices are dropping very rapidly, it usually also means that your PPD is going to be bigger than normal. And while that sounds like a good thing, I'd rather have, kind of a modest PPD with higher prices than I would prices that are dropping fast. The other time that we can have negative PPDs is when we get a very large difference between class 3 and class 4 prices. And the reason for that is that class 1 pricing was changed from being the higher of class 3 or class 4 in this last farm bill. It was changed to the average of. And we've had some very large differences between class 3 and 4 over this past year. They've been as much as $10 a hundredweight difference. And when that's true, if class 3 is the larger one, again, we can pay more out in components than we've taken in through the combined values of class 3 and 4. That's what's happening much of the time right now when we have negative PPDs. It's because class 3 and 4 prices have been quite a bit different and quite a ways apart. So remember this equalization payment, when plants are normally making that, class 1 plants are paying into the pool and manufacturing plants drawing out of the pool. Well, under a negative PPD, it can be exactly the opposite. So here's an example of what I showed before that was happening, that here class 1 plants are paying into the pool, manufacturing plants are getting to take that out. This is why these plants want to be regulated. But under negative PPD, you don't have to be regulated if you're not a class 1 plant. You can depool your milk, and that sometimes happens. If you anticipate, you might have to pay into the pool instead. So let's look at this case. Now I've just switched this to class 3 plants having a $20 minimum price, and the class 1 is 18. Under this circumstance, Class 3 plants would have to pay $18.80 to their farmers, the blend price, and they would have to contribute $1.20 to the pool for all these other plants to take a draw from to pay their producers. But remember, they don't have to be regulated. If they choose to depool their milk, then they don't have to pay this money into the pool for other plants to use. So under that circumstance, you could say, well, what do they pay? Do they pay the $20 to their farmers? They could. Some plants might, which would be a good thing for their farmers. Instead of $18.80, you get 20 bucks. Or they could look and say, well, it looks like the pool value is going to be $18.80, so I'll pay $18.80 to my dairy farmers. And, they're no worse off than they would have been if I stayed in the pool. But these other plants, don't get to take my money. Or they could pay something else. And in my looking at milk checks under recent months here, where we've seen this kind of depooling going on, what I've seen is that plants have kind of split this. So they've paid a bit more to their farms than the $18.80, but they haven't paid the full $20 amount. So in other words, plants keep a little bit of it, and their farmers get to keep a little bit of it. The plants that are not getting to take a draw from the pool are the ones that probably didn't do so well. Here's an example milk check. And this is one thing I just wanted to walk through briefly before we start taking some questions. And just walk you through it. This is the University Farms milk check. So University has dairy herd, of course, for research purposes. And your milk checks may look very much like this. This happened to be from Foremost Farms. On almost all milk checks, you will find the daily milk weights out here. How much did you ship every single day? That shows you for the pay period, the pounds of milk that are going to be in there. And you are going to get the monthly total over here. So this shows that over these 31 days in what month was this? This was for July, the month of July 2018, that this farm shipped 1.3 million pounds of milk. And here shows you what the average butterfat test and protein was, and average solids, and what the somatic cell count was, and a few of the other quality standards like plate counts and so forth. This, of course, shows you not just the percent test, but the pounds of butterfat represented by that in your milk. So if you multiplied this 1.3 million times your 3.65%, you would get your 47,000 pounds of butterfat. And this is what farms are being paid for. Here's the unit price. This was exactly what I showed you on the component announcement sheet. So this is the value per pound of butterfat, shows you what the total value was on here. This check also is showing you your year-to-date values. Here's the protein unit price, here's the pounds of protein, here's the protein value in your check, and so forth. Most checks will have the component values printed out just like this. The total of the component values is shown in here, and on a per hundredweight basis, 1465 was the value per hundredweight. This farm also received a few premiums, and this is typical. Remember, I said that there are going to be premiums usually paid above the regulated minimum prices. These are regulated minimums. These are voluntary premiums. A volume premium just means that this farm shipped enough volume of milk to get a 34-cent per hundredweight premium. It also had pretty good quality milk and received a 19-cent premium for that. There was some zone differentials, then I didn't go into that and won't right now, unless you have a question about it. And there was a tanker load credit because this farm actually filled up a tanker of milk a day. And then a few other adjustments on it, but that's what gets you down to the gross pay of about $15.19. So here was the minimum component value, $14.65. Here was what the farm actually received, $15.19. Here's just a few other things that are deductions often seen on the milk checks too, after that minimum pay price out there. Hauling charge is almost always going to be on there, and you can see what the gross pay minus the hauling cost was. This farm paid a little over $2,000 that month for hauling. This shows you the mid-month check that was received. So there's an estimated check that comes about mid-month usually, and that gets taken out of the full month's estimate here too. There's always state and national promotions. This is the 15-cent deductions that you get from your milk check. 10 cents of that in Wisconsin goes to the state, and 5 cents goes to the national promotion. This cooperative participates with Cooperatives Working Together, or CWT. And so there's a deduction shown on here for that as well. And then some other adjustments that may be fees for the co-op. I'm not sure about that on this particular example. But that's what's in your milk check, and that's how most of those values are derived. This farm, in this particular month, where is, I was looking for the PPD. And I should have looked at this earlier. I didn't notice that on here. Well, it's on the check somewhere, apparently not on the two pieces that I captured. But the PPD would always be on there as well. And, with that, Lisa, I don't know if we had additional questions that people wanted to ask, but I would be happy to answer those if we did.
Yeah, so I don't think I've seen anything come through the chat just yet, but we did have a question about, this is a rather complex and complicated process with milk pricing. Is there a way that we can, decipher this down a little bit, and why is it so complicated? We have all these federal milk orders. Are there things that we can do? Do we have to have the federal milk orders, and maybe how would that affect what our milk checks look like?
Sure, be happy to answer that. The answer is simple. No, we don't have to have federal milk marketing orders. As I mentioned before, that's a producer decision. Dairy farmers get to vote once in a while on changes to federal orders, and dairy farmers can vote federal orders out of existence. The last federal order that we had voted out of existence was a federal order that was up in the northwest part of the country. And the federal order was voted out by dairy producers because most of them belong to one co-op, and the co-op felt as though they would rather keep most of that money from dairy processors themselves rather than share it with other farmers. So that was one case where the co-op got the federal order voted out. You could do the same kind of thing here. Now, the other option is that there are a number of plants in the state that don't have their milk being regulated by federal milk marketing orders. They've simply decided that I'm too small, or I make a specialty product, or I want milk from certain kinds of farms, and that's all I'm going to buy. I don't care to be regulated or participate. And if you ship your milk to that kind of farm, then it's really a matter of negotiation at that point in time as to what your milk price is going to be. And in areas where it's unregulated milk, that's exactly the case. Now, usually plants will have some kind of a product price formula that they use themselves to determine those monthly milk values. But at that point in time, it's not enforced. Nobody's regulating it. You have a contract that says I will deliver so much milk, and here's how we'll determine what that value is or the price is.
As a follow-up to that, Mark, are there certain times of the year that farmers should maybe be watching for details about when decisions are being made about federal orders? Is that something that they're getting from their milk plant, or are there other ways that they should be following to keep track of those federal milk orders that may be kind of being reviewed?
That's a good question. One of the frustrations that a lot of people have with federal milk marketing orders is that the pace of change is glacial. It's difficult to pull together a hearing, even if it's just a regional hearing or the order that you're actually in, or if it's a national hearing, it's much more cumbersome. It can take years for that hearing to be announced, to be organized, to be held before you actually get a recommended decision that comes back to be voted on. There'll be plenty of news about that going on. But the other thing I would say is that watch your milk checks. There would oftentimes be a letter or a notice that comes in there about changes in the federal milk marketing order. So your milk check is going to try to alert you before there's anything that's actually changed. Um, it, it I say that, and yet, for example, we had Congress that made a change to federal milk marketing orders in the last farm bill, where they changed class one pricing from the higher of to the average of. Relatively small change. It's had an impact though in your milk checks because we've had more negative PPDs as a result of that. So, that was one where Congress made a change. That doesn't usually happen. It's almost always through a federal order hearing process.
Mhm. Okay, we had some questions come through the chat. So the first one was, if class 3 processors depool, where does the money come from to make up the difference for, say, the class 1 processors in the event of that negative PPD?
Well, the truth of the matter is, there isn't money that comes in. I mean, so if you think about that last example that I showed where the class 3 prices were higher, you're actually taking some money out of that pool calculation. You're taking that higher $20 value that I used in the example out, and that's not there. So the whole value of the pool actually declines a little bit because you've taken the bigger value out of the pool. And you might well ask, well, where did that go? And I tried to indicate that usually that somehow gets shared between the processor who depooled their milk and their farmers. A good example was a negative PPD that we had. Oh, I can't remember. It was like a negative $5 PPD this summer that went on. Milk checks that I looked at were paying farms. The checks were still printed out exactly as they always were, which showed the component values and it showed a PPD value. But it didn't show that negative $5 PPD. It showed something like a negative $2.80 PPD or something like that. So it was still negative, but it wasn't as negative as farms who stayed in or shipped milk to plants that stayed in the pool. So in other words, that plant was sharing some of that value back to their producers. Not all of it, but some of it.
Thank you. We had another question come in. Can you please explain how block voting works, and does this type of voting take away individual dairy farmers' voices in the voting process?
Sure. And this is one of those where I'm going to give you a it depends answer. Block voting is the process by which cooperatives would cast a single vote for all of their members. Now, normally, there would be a process that the cooperative has and goes through where they try to explain the vote to their members and to their board. And the board, is going to come up with a recommendation. Well, we want to vote yay, or we want to vote nay on this. And when that happens, the co-op casts their vote for all of the members. That's block voting. Of course, you may have some dissension in members. Some members may feel like, yeah, I want to vote yes for this. And others might feel like, no, I don't like that. In some cooperatives, you can choose to announce that I want to cast my own vote. So the co-op would block vote for everybody but your vote, and you get to vote on your own. That's not true for all, but that's true for many cooperatives. And anybody, of course, who directs ships to an unregulated processor, or not unregulated processor, or there would be a regulated processor, will get to cast their independent vote if it's not if they aren't a member of a cooperative.
Okay, thank you for that. And we had one last comment that had come in, and maybe this is something that you can maybe elaborate on a little bit more. One of the most frustrating aspects is the broad range of prices that's paid amongst neighbors shipping to different plants, both making cheese, and that was really apparent with the PPDs last summer and early fall. Could you speak a little more to that and why there may be larger differences between farms that are shipping to different plants?
Sure. Here's a good example. If you have 2 or 3 cheese plants and they all depool, then this is going to be a case where we're no longer regulated and we get to make our own decisions about what we pay for milk. Now, a plant is going to pay whatever they think it takes to keep milk coming into that door of the plant. They want to make cheese out of the milk. And if they don't pay enough, and farms get to understand, well, my check was lower than my neighbors who shipped to somebody else, then sooner or later that milk is going to move from the plant that paid less to the one that paid more. And that's why things tend to equal out. However, in some regions of the state, we have plants that ship their milk into different orders. So for example, down in the southwest part of the state, you may have folks that ship milk into order 30, the upper Midwest order, or folks that are shipping milk into the central order. And those pools are different. Their pool values are different. And this is where we saw farms from the upper Midwest maybe have a negative $5 PPD, and farms shipping milk into that central order had a negative $8 PPD. So you may have been right across the road from your neighbor and you had a $3 different milk price. And that was all because of utilization and pooling in those different orders. That will always happen. You'll have different, paychecks based on those different orders, but that was kind of an extreme case.
Okay, and seeing that we're coming upon the hour, we've got, I think, one last question that we'll get to, and if we get more in the chat, we'll have to follow those up with you, Mark, and get some answers that way. So the last question that was dropped in the chat was, in most markets, the price of the raw material determines the price of the finished product. Why can't the dairy industry adopt a similar pricing structure?
That has more to do with the relative, well, almost the first slide that I showed here. What are the special characteristics of milk? It's perishable. It has many more sellers, meaning farmers, than buyers. If you think about a different kind of marketing chain, you may have an instance where you've got relatively more buyers than you have sellers of products. Maybe you can think of microchips or something. Relatively few firms make microchips. Quite a few firms use microchips. That's a case where the microchip manufacturer may actually, who makes the product that people are buying, may actually have more control of the price. So with farms, it's a little bit different. We have many more farms, and that's reason that we don't determine the price at the farm level and then move that on up the line. But I did say that if we had an unregulated system, I think you would find that farms and plants would run toward one another and say, we need to have a contract. I want to secure your milk, but that's going to be a contract for both price and quantity. You will be expected to deliver this much milk over this time period to my plant of this quality, and I agree to pay you this price. If you want to ship more milk, we'll have to have a talk about that. Or if you don't ship enough milk, we'll have to have a talk about that too. So, that changes fundamentally, I think, kind of the structure of what we have in a business like this.
Great, thank you. So as we're wrapping up here today, I think we've got one last poll that we were going to put up, I believe. And while that's coming up, I just wanted to remind everybody that there are some supplemental documents that Mark had mentioned. Those are going to get posted to the Heart of the Farm website that you can see on the screen here, that link. And the other thing that I wanted to mention before giving this back over to Jenny is that we do have one more winter 2021 Heart of the Farm series meetings left on March 8th, and that is going to be on developing your farm product brand. We're going to have Jenny Gavin from Gavin Farms out of Reedsburg talk about have you ever wanted to brand and market your farm's product? Jenny's going to be discussing how she and her husband had developed their brand and began marketing beef directly to their consumers, and then leading to opening a farm store. So if you want to learn more about that, do join us on March 8th. And it looks like we've got the poll up now. So if you can take a couple minutes and fill that out for us, we'd much appreciate it. And Jenny, I think you had a couple of words that you wanted to wrap up with.
I just wanted to thank Lisa and Mark very much. I personally learned quite a bit over on how to read the milk check, and hope everybody else did too. I just wanted to call attention to the Division of Extension's Farm Ready Research webinars that have been going on about dairy and livestock farm management topics. And Heather just put into the chat a link to those. Those will be running through April. So hopefully you will join up on one of those as well. And with that, I just kind of thank you for joining us this morning. And if you had any questions for Mark, let myself or anybody else know, and we will get back to you with some more answers. And we will have all of his presentation and supporting documents listed on the Heart of the Farm, hopefully by the end of the week. Thank you very much for joining.